and I will turn thee back, an op-ed to current affairs. The above verse is found in Ezekiel 38, a passage everyone in the Christian world is talking about, and some naming the Russians as one of the main players identified as Rosh in some translations. The KJV and others referencing proper Hebrew doesn't use that word. The other players in the Confederate are also named in this passage. Here I would like to find out more about the groups of people and where they were from, with my personal interest in geographical mapping and eschatology passages. I will be using Wikipedia for links, although they may be a far-left organization known to edit out certain truths to fit the globalist narrative, but these subjects are historical in nature and quoting historians, so take it with a pinch of salt. With the current state of affairs in the world, we are learning and beginning to realize that there are some hideous entities with agendas and getting their hands in these things. If one doesn't see or just as much as feels so, then I think it's much akin to having the head in the sand and everything is fine, then this probably wouldn't interest you. After the flood, Noah had 3 sons, Japheth the elder, Shem and Ham. Their generations were appointed the lands in Asia with the exception of Ham to the African continent. Here we concentrate on Japheth the elder kid. Japheth. Genesis 9:27, God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. This verse talks about Canaan's descendants having to serve Japheth because his father Ham wronged Noah by some things he had done. That's another story for another day. Some also say to dwell in the tents of Shem mean to have their people mixed in marriage, which I think would happen ultimately if you go live in someone else's land, which would explain the additional skin tones of some people further south being lighter presumably. Also, if indeed intermarriages happened, it still did not make them Jews in God's eyes circumstantially. That is not conclusive and also another story for another day. Genesis 10:2, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. Verse 3, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Rephath, and Togarmah. Verse 4, and the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. 5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Further down in time antiquity we arrived at the below with their peoples as known in historic writings. I will just put links here for reference. This op-ed is trying to hypothesize the group of people in Ezekiel 38 more accurately so as to know what timeline we are in. Just like every fact/judgment, a hypothesis is first tested in the lab. With the below links, you may be led to other links further describing peoples and geography or stories of their cultures, interesting to read to support the hypothesis. Fun facts. In the Book of Enoch, which is not in the canon, Noah had an interesting childbirth. He was said to be born an albino and had long white locks, dimdima, in the Ethiopian language. Have a read here the chapter describing this. Perhaps the gene pool in albinism can produce people of different pigmentation later, but that's something for the scientist to explain. Because of the practices and cultures of some of the related peoples, here are some of the notable descriptions of interest. Scythians. Scythians, a group of people from Magog, who displaced and replaced the Sumerians, 1000 to 800 BC. Sumerians were from the Pontic-Caspian steppes who were said to have migrated southwards and also into Europe. Scythians later were known to be synonymously associated with them when lands were conquered. Known for, obtained much wealth in the slave trade, barbaric, beheading enemies, use skin to make handkerchiefs, known in historic writings to be red hair with blue-gray eyes and unusually tall. In Ezekiel 27:13, the peoples of the Grecian Isles, Anatolian Tubal and Meshech were offering slaves in Tyre as mentioned below, possibly as far back as 600 BC when Ezekiel lived. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech, they were thy merchants, they traded the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market. Some of the practices of war were similar to what the Germans did in World War II, just saying. Paul's missionary travels. In Paul's travels throughout the Mediterranean, see below map, he wrote in Colossians 3:11, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all, and in all. If we reference the Scythians mentioned here to those in the writings above, then we would see them as being ruffians as well. As of the time of Paul, these people from the lineage of Magog would have already migrated to Asia Minor as described in the historical records. Note is taken here that since the Scythians were into the slave trade, culturally the rich would have had servants bought and sold, and that brings us to the book of Philemon of Colossae, just a little southeast of Laodicea. In the book of Philemon, Paul wrote to Philemon about returning Onesimus and to see the latter not as a servant but as a brother from then onwards. This indicated that Philemon was rich and had him as a servant/slave before, which indicated the owner-servant relationship was normal though he was a believer. Onesimus must have been sent from Philemon to Paul as a helper in his journeys and returned as a believer. As an afterthought, similarly in the early history of a certain two-party country, there was a party who did not want to abolish the slave trade. You see where I'm going with this. Kartsars. Kartsars, a group of people said to have been related to Togarma. Do read the Togarma link above and Kartsars below for some interesting stories. Known for initiation rituals, notables, adopted Judaism, suggested as early as 740, geostrategic decision due to Byzantine and Islamic empires in dual courtship. There are scholastic articles that indicate that the Kartsars did not turn to Judaism and also are not the Ashkenazi Jews who migrated to Europe, those that were persecuted in World War II and now have returned to Israel. Some of the practices were a picture to what Freemasons do, such as the detailed initiation practices, some of which carried down to the Chinese secret societies in Asia in the era of the British Empire, including hand signals. The Chinese secret societies were into gang-related illicit trades and had the blessing of the colonial masters, as everybody benefited from the increase in wealth. If historic writings are right, the Kartsars came from the people of Togarma. In the following verses in the Bible, they traded in Lebanon bringing their horses, an indication that where they came from had this commodity. Here is a link to the region where this resource is known for. Chapter in the Bible about ancient trade routes and wares of Tyre, Lebanon. Ezekiel 27:14, They of the house of Togarma traded in thy fairs with horses and horsemen and mules. Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz, Gomer's first son, Ashkenaz, read link above. Believed to be a nomadic people in the Scythian region, later in the Slavic territories, and from the 11th century in Germany and Northern Europe. They were also known to be settled around Asia Minor later. These are known now as the Ashkenazi Jews who returned to Israel after World War II. Chapter in Bible about judgment of Babylon with reference made to Ashkenaz. Jeremiah 51:27, Set ye up a standard in the land, blow the trumpet among the nations, prepare the nations against her, call together against her the kingdoms of Ararat, Minni, and Ashkenaz, appoint a captain against her, cause the horses to come up as the rough caterpillars. Location-wise, the above would seem to indicate that the Ashkenaz people were grouped close by to these two other kingdoms, see above map area between the Black and Caspian Seas near Iran, and they have horses too. Time-wise, this passage has prophetic nuances of the latter days whereby Babylon is an entity and many peoples shall be called upon to pass judgment on her. Also verse 45 has parallels to Revelation 18:4, but that's another op-ed for another day. So, are the Ashkenazis really Jews? From the Bible back to Genesis 10:5, God clearly said these Gentiles were divided their lands and their nations. Jews were not in existence until Abraham, and he came from Shem. Not invited, never was. In Revelation in the letter to the church at Smyrna, which is located in Asia Minor, Jesus through John mentioned about a group of people whom they had to contend with, possibly troublemakers in their view. Verse 8, And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead, and is alive. Verse 9, I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Verse 10, Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Verse 11, He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Not Jews but of the synagogue of Satan. Now, that is a serious statement. Any group or groups of people in the present day that you know of, that are up to their eyeballs in nefarious shenanigans in the world? So, were these people already back in the lands according to Genesis in the days of Paul and John's writings? Or are Revelation's verses pointing to a time way forward into the future? With that thought in mind, let's revisit Ezekiel's prophesy. Ezekiel 38. Verse 1, And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying. Verse 2, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Firstly, Gog is not clearly described in the Bible other than 1 Chronicles 5:4, and even that does not really identify as the same. Bible prophesy more rightly points Gog to the evil one or the Antichrist. From Magog came the peoples of those described here in the hypothesis as Scythians or their mixture with the Cimmerians. Gog the entity leads people from the Asia Minor area. In Hebrew, it reads, Set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog. Therefore, it is safe to say here for this hypothesis the chief is originally a red hair with blue-gray eyes and unnaturally tall as described of the Scythians. Verse 3, And say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Also he has become chief of these two peoples as well. Verse 4, And I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. During the time of Ezekiel, 600 BC or so, he has gone away from his designated place and will be placed back. He will have all sorts of armor, presumably insignias of different armies. At the time of Paul in the early century AD, the Scythians, if we assume them to be of Magog, were already settled in Asia Minor. It could also mean a future scenario, now that there is mention that certain groups of people see Ukraine as the Greater Israel. It begs to confer a rethink of what it means, not by power nor by might but by my spirit. Verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Verse 6, Gomer, and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Gomer is associated to Cimmerians in the Caucasus, so is Togarmah. According to Josephus they are from Anatolian Galatia, which is close by, indicating that if they had gone anywhere in antiquity, they were already back south of the Black Sea, at least in the late centuries BC and up to Paul's time. Verse 7, Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. This refers to Gog to be in charge of these armies. Verse 8, After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely all of them. After many days, presumably after being back in their settled lands, which places them closer to the Mediterranean, they will come against Israel. Between the verses 4 and 8 it could mean years or even spanned millennia to our current time. Verse 9, Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm, thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou, and all thy bands, and many people with thee. Verse 10, Thus saith the Lord God, It shall also come to pass, that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Verse 11, And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages, I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. Unwalled villages may mean not geared up for battle. Most people regard this land as Israel, judging from the context in verse 12. Verse 12, to take a spoil, and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land. The people identified are most probably the ones mentioned in Genesis 46:6, and they took their cattle, and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him. Verse 13, Sheba, and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? To carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? Saudi and Yemen and the businessmen of the isles made comments about what is happening. Verse 14, Therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say unto Gog, Thus saith the Lord God, In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? Verse 15, And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou, and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company, and a mighty army. Anatolia is where the people reporting to Gog came from, and thy place fits well. Verse 16, And thou shalt come up against my people of Israel, as a cloud to cover the land, it shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. Verse 17, Thus saith the Lord God, Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? Verse 18, And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. The phrase at the same time appears several times above in this passage, may point to these things happening at the same time. However, it could be interspersed, spreading this passage through time. Verse 19, For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken, surely, in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. Verse 20, So that the fishes of the sea, and the fowls of the heaven, and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep upon the earth, and all the men that are upon the face of the earth, shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. This verse points to a time mentioned in Revelation during the 7 trumpets and 7 bowls. Verse 21, And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God, every man's sword shall be against his brother. Verse 22, And I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain, and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Verse 23, Thus will I magnify myself, and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. In modern times, Turkey is the locale where Tubal and Meshech are. If we think of the government there as the chief prince, then Turkey, who is mainly a Muslim country, is Gog or the assumed Antichrist. However, they could be people who migrated eastwards from Central Asia closer to the Stans countries. Another idea that I have is that since Turkey is now a NATO member, the chief prince, if you think in terms of war, is sitting in Europe, which brings us back to the Scythians whom Magog came from, blue-grey eyes and unusually tall people, which makes you think what it means, and the God says, and I will turn thee back. One more scenario which is hard to think of is the topsy-turvy relationship between Putin and Erdogan, which makes you think about the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. How is it possible a NATO member and Russia could attack Israel in unison? Wouldn't that bring the whole of NATO to bear upon Israel? Who are those naughty boys now? Current-day conspiracy theories? Of late, world governments are much in sync with each other, such as this virulent episode. Many will not believe in these conspiracies from non-mainstream media. However, the mainstream media can hardly be trusted neither, thereby requiring us to be educated ourselves. Conspiracies such as The United Nations being a body created to enable the globalist plan. NATO not being an altruistic organization to prevent conflict but allow conflicts when the need is required of the military-industrial complex. That NATO is controlled by a group of ultra-rich in control of most of the military-industrial complex whose interest is in playing both sides of any war. Entities such as the Federal Reserve, world central banks, filtering down to the Davos crowd of the WEF, are all in cahoots to the globalist agenda, enriching themselves while diminishing the laity below with every opportunity they can come up with, such as the virulent episode, ESG, and the coming digital IDs for everything, just like the inoculation differentiation systems. The lockups during the virulent episode to displace small businesses while the ultra-rich buy up food farms, pharmaceuticals, distribution lines, etc., in preparedness for the hard times ahead where they are the only services you can access, given that you have scored well in your ESG scores. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero held during the last COP26 meeting, that they are introducing this together with all the central banks and private banks who will only allow you access to such services if you have good ESG scores, companies and even individuals alike. They will take government public money which is yours in some way, and enrich the private in their green initiatives in public-private business partnerships. This is another scam that I lump with Revelation First Seal, besides the virulent episode. That the world central banks have no other way to escape the fiat money they have printed since 1971, that debts cannot be serviced and they want to instigate a great reset to wipe out all, meaning all that the boomers have benefited from will cause their generations to go to the dumpster. World retirement funds at peril because government bonds may be useless altogether. All our money in the banks is just a data point that is lent out to the world for the elites to play. Well, that's a fact and not a conspiracy. If the system goes down, nada, zilch. That's when the central banks will issue pittance if you have a digital ID with good ESG to buy and sell. That the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders School, whose alumni are many world leaders, and the Global Shapers community training the young in far-left ideologies to penetrate governments. That Bolshevism is back and Russia is taking them out now in Ukraine. That World War II in Europe is about non-Jews exterminating people who unknowingly think they are Jews, and that the former is still around today and will try to do the same. Most if not all of the shenanigans are designed by the Western Hemisphere. Of course they are supported by many in other continents intertwined in mostly monetary rewards. If you think about it, Gog is indeed orchestrating all these as we believed. It's really a dominion and not an individual, but he has tools out of all these entities and people. 2 Thessalonians 2:7 For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. Scotty Clark explains this passage very well in his YouTube channel. Check him out. Verse 8, And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Revelation Seals. From watching these events, I've come to the conjecture that the judgments from the wrath of God are the 7 trumpets and 7 vials. The first 4 revelation seals of hoaxes, war, famine, inflation and death are a result of hunger, sickness and disease from the after effects and chaos of war, which are all a result of the doings of the evil one. From the 6th seal forward, it is a signal of all these terrible things confirming the wrath of God about to come. Come to think of it, all these lies and false flags resulting in conflicts of all sorts including economic ones throughout the years, I wonder when the first seal was ever opened. Since the 4 horses of Revelation will result in a quarter dead, it does seem the purpose may be shadowing the depopulation agenda of the New World Order. The virulent agent came as an engineered spike and released into the world, is not natural and mutated in humans. The vaccinations resulted in deaths. This fits into the globalists' agenda of depopulation. The rider on the white horse had a bow without an arrow but was able to conquer, suggesting it's a hoax, as to most happenings now including world powers lying about each other in conflicts and the mainstream media sweeping truths under the carpet. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is another hoax they are trying to push, climate change. After the 4 horses from the 4 seals, about 1.39 billion, a quarter of the earth, Revelation 6:8, people would have ceased from the earth. Russia's Putin may or may not be with the New World Order. He himself is of Western descent and considered here to be Scythian, but so is everybody else in the skin of game. Klaus Schwab said he was their student from the young global leaders at some point in the past, but then again, he's a KGB, so pray tell. As of now he seems to be trying to get rid of some of these Kartsarians as well as blowing up biolabs set up by the US in Ukraine. If that's true, good on him. Let's not forget God called Nebuchadnezzar my servant. But then again, the situation of sanctions on both sides may send the whole earth into a depression not seen since 1929 and even worse, which by the way could be the game plan of the globalists' Great Reset. Perhaps we have to leave Ezekiel 38 aside at the moment and contend with the Revelation seals first. Okay, that much of an op-ed from Japheth till now. Any relation, significance, prophesy coming to light, that's up to you to think about. Everything's a mess anyway.